You'll never be part of this family. The words landed across the ballroom with the weight of a slammed door. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of guests gathered inside the Grand Lakeshore Hotel in downtown Chicago, but for one suspended moment, every conversation stopped. Richard Walker, 62, stood near the center of the engagement celebration with a glass in one hand and judgment in the other. His eyes were fixed on Marcus Bennett. "I don't care what story you've told people," Richard said, his voice carrying far beyond the circle around him. "My daughter deserves better." The room seemed to shrink. Marcus Bennett stood quietly in a tailored dark suit, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He simply listened. That calmness irritated Richard even more. Around them, guests exchanged uncertain looks. Some recognized Richard immediately. He was a respected businessman, a donor, a man whose opinions often became the opinions of everyone around him. Others looked toward Marcus, trying to place him. He wasn't wearing a flashy watch. He wasn't surrounded by assistants. He wasn't drawing attention to himself. To most people in the room, he looked like an ordinary guest who had wandered into the wrong conversation. Richard took a slow sip from his drink and shook his head. "Emily has worked too hard to throw her future away." A nervous laugh escaped from somewhere behind him. Another guest nodded slightly. The energy in the room began shifting toward Richard, the way crowds often drift toward confidence before they drift toward truth. Marcus remained still. The silence around him felt deliberate, almost strategic. Across the ballroom, a string quartet continued playing softly, unaware that the entire evening was beginning to tilt in a different direction. Near the grand staircase, Emily Walker froze. She had been speaking with two friends when she heard her father's voice rise above the music. Her smile vanished instantly. She knew that tone. She knew what it meant. Without a word, she started moving toward the crowd. Richard wasn't finished. "A man should know when he's out of his league," he continued. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with open curiosity. Marcus met Richard's gaze but said nothing. There was no anger in his eyes. No embarrassment. If anything, there was patience. The kind of patience that comes from surviving things much heavier than public judgment. Richard mistook that silence for weakness. Many people did. "You're not the future I imagined for my daughter," he declared. The words echoed through the ballroom. Somewhere near the back wall, a server stopped walking. A photographer lowered her camera. Even the music seemed distant now. Marcus slowly set his untouched glass on a nearby table. His movements were measured, controlled. Not because he lacked a response. Because he understood something nobody else in that room understood yet. The truth didn't need to rush. It was already on its way. And as Emily pushed through the crowd, her face pale with concern, the first cracks began forming beneath the story her father believed he was telling. Emily Walker reached the edge of the crowd just as another uneasy silence settled over the ballroom. The crystal lights above reflected across polished marble floors, but the warmth of the celebration had vanished. It felt as though the entire room was waiting for Marcus Bennett to finally defend himself. He did not. That surprised people more than any argument could have. Richard Walker folded his arms and looked around, encouraged by the attention. The longer Marcus remained silent, the more convinced Richard became that he was winning. "You see?" Richard said, glancing toward several guests nearby. A man with nothing to hide would have answered by now. A few people exchanged uncertain looks. Others nodded. Assumptions spread through the room faster than facts ever could. Marcus stood calmly beside a tall window overlooking the Chicago skyline. Beyond the glass, the city lights stretched for miles. Inside, dozens of strangers were building a story about him without knowing a single chapter of his life. Yet his expression never changed. Emily felt a knot tighten in her chest. She knew Marcus. She knew the discipline it took for him to remain this composed. Most people would have walked away. Others would have argued. Marcus simply listened. That was what worried her. It meant he understood something everyone else had missed. Richard stepped closer. Tell me something, Marcus. What exactly do you think you bring into my daughter's life? The question hung in the air. Several guests leaned in slightly. They expected a defense. A resume. A list of accomplishments. Instead, Marcus offered a small smile. Not arrogant. Not offended. Just calm. Emily can speak for herself, he said quietly. The answer only irritated Richard further. That is the problem, Richard replied. She does not always see people for what they are. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Her father had no idea how wrong he was. Near the back of the ballroom, two executives whispered to each other. One thought Marcus looked familiar. The other could not place him. A woman near the dessert table studied him carefully, convinced she had seen him in a business magazine. Nobody could quite connect the dots. Marcus had spent years building companies, leading negotiations, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet tonight, surrounded by wealth and influence, people judged him entirely by appearances. The irony would have been amusing if it were not so revealing. Richard straightened his jacket and looked toward the guests again. I spent my entire life protecting my family, he announced. I know what is best for my daughter. Emily finally stepped forward. Dad, she said firmly. The single word cut through the room sharper than any speech. Richard turned. Surprise flashed across his face. He had not realized she had been listening. Emily looked from her father to Marcus and back again. Around them, every eye followed her. The celebration was no longer about an engagement party. It had become something else entirely. Something bigger. Something that had been building long before this evening began. And as Emily took another step forward, Marcus remained perfectly still, while the first pieces of a hidden truth began moving quietly into place. Richard Walker sensed the room shifting and immediately tried to pull it back under his control. Emily, he said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes, you do not need to defend this man. The words echoed across the ballroom. Several guests nodded in agreement. Others watched carefully, sensing that something beneath the surface was beginning to move. Emily stopped a few feet from Marcus. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before returning to her father. You do not know him, she said quietly. Richard laughed once. It was not a warm laugh. It was the kind people use when they believe they have already won. I know enough, he replied. I know where he came from. I know he is not the kind of man who belongs in this world. A murmur spread through the crowd. Marcus remained motionless. His calm seemed almost impossible now. Every accusation drifted toward him like smoke, yet none of them appeared to land. Richard noticed the silence and mistook it for surrender. People spend their entire lives trying to reach rooms like this, he continued. Some earn their place. Others simply find a way inside. The implication hung heavily in the air. A few guests looked down. Others looked directly at Marcus, searching for a reaction. They found none. Near the back of the ballroom, a man in an expensive navy suit narrowed his eyes. He had been studying Marcus for several minutes. There was something familiar about him. A memory lingered just out of reach. Beside him, another guest quietly opened a business news application on her phone. She glanced at a photograph, then back at Marcus. Her expression changed slightly. Not recognition. Not yet. But close. Emily folded her arms. Dad, stop. Richard ignored her. Years of authority had taught him that the loudest voice often controlled the story. Do you know what concerns me most? He asked the room. It is not who he is. It is what he wants. The crowd listened. Men like him always want something. Marcus slowly turned his head toward Richard. For the first time all evening, their eyes met without interruption. The room became still. Richard expected anger. Instead he found patience. That unsettled him more than any argument could have. Marcus spoke softly. You have decided who I am without asking a single question. Richard scoffed. I do not need questions. That is the problem, Marcus replied. The sentence was calm, but it landed with surprising force. Several guests exchanged glances. One woman lowered her champagne glass. Another stepped closer, curious now rather than judgmental. Emily could feel the atmosphere changing. Her father could not. He was too focused on protecting a version of reality he had already chosen. Across the ballroom, the woman with the phone stared at the image on her screen again. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she showed it to the man beside her. He looked from the photograph to Marcus. His face drained of color. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. For the first time that evening, someone in the room was beginning to understand exactly who Marcus Bennett was. And the moment that realization spread beyond those two people, everything Richard believed would begin to collapse. The realization had not reached the entire ballroom yet, but it was spreading. Quietly. Relentlessly. Like a crack moving through glass. The woman holding the phone lowered it slowly and whispered something to the man beside her. His eyes widened. He looked at Marcus again, then back at the screen. Neither interrupted the confrontation. They simply watched. Emily noticed them immediately. She knew that look. It was the look people wore when a story they believed suddenly stopped making sense. Richard, however, remained unaware. He was too focused on Marcus. Too focused on proving a point. Emily, he said firmly, you are letting emotions cloud your judgment. Emily stared at her father. No, Dad. That is exactly what you are doing. The response caught him off guard. Several guests shifted closer. The room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a courtroom where everyone was waiting for evidence to appear. Richard shook his head. You barely know this man. A faint smile appeared on Emily's face. Not because the situation was amusing. Because the statement was so completely wrong. She knew more about Marcus than her father could possibly imagine. Yet she could not tell the truth. Not yet. She had promised. 3 years earlier, Marcus had asked her for one thing. When the time came, the truth had to reveal itself naturally. No shortcuts. No announcements. No special treatment. At the time she had not understood why. Standing here tonight, she finally did. The people around them were exposing themselves without realizing it. Every assumption. Every judgment. Every hidden belief. Marcus was not testing the room. The room was testing itself. Emily glanced toward him. His expression remained calm. The same calm she had seen during board meetings. During crises. During moments that would have overwhelmed most people. Nothing seemed to shake him. That was one of the reasons she respected him so deeply. Respect. The word echoed in her mind. Because despite what everyone assumed, that was all this relationship had ever been built on. Respect. Across the ballroom, whispers multiplied. A guest quietly searched Marcus Bennett's name online. Another guest leaned over her shoulder. A third joined them moments later. Small reactions began appearing throughout the room. Raised eyebrows. Sudden silence. Confused expressions. The information was spreading faster now. Richard noticed none of it. I have spent 62 years learning how to read people, he announced. I know character when I see it. Marcus finally spoke. Do you? The question was simple. Almost gentle. Yet it landed harder than any speech Richard had given all evening. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. Only for a second. Then it vanished. Emily saw it anyway. So did several guests. The confidence that had carried him through the night was beginning to crack. Not because Marcus was fighting back. Because he was not. The absence of anger was becoming impossible to ignore. The absence of defense was becoming its own defense. Emily took a slow breath. The secret she had protected for years sat only a few feet away from becoming public. And judging by the growing whispers around the ballroom, that moment was much closer than anyone realized. The whispers around the ballroom faded into the background as Emily looked at Marcus and remembered a night she had spent years trying to forget. 3 years earlier, a freezing rainstorm had covered the streets outside Milwaukee. Traffic moved slowly. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Emily had been driving home after a charity event when everything in her carefully planned life changed in a matter of seconds. She remembered sitting alone afterward in a hospital room, staring at a ceiling she could not stop looking at because she was afraid to think about what had happened. The doctors were encouraging. Her family was worried. Friends came and went. Flowers filled the room. Yet the person she remembered most was not a relative, not a friend, and not someone she had known. It was a stranger. A man who had quietly appeared during the most difficult moment of her life and then disappeared before anyone thought to ask questions. Back in the present, Emily watched Marcus standing beneath the ballroom lights and felt the same sense of certainty she had felt then. Richard continued speaking, unaware of the memories moving through his daughter's mind. "You are making a mistake," he said. "One day you will thank me for protecting you." Emily almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny. Because her father had spent years believing he had protected her from dangers he could see while remaining completely unaware of the person who had actually helped her when everything fell apart. Across the room, more guests were quietly searching Marcus Bennett's name. The reactions were becoming harder to hide. One guest lowered his phone and stared in disbelief. Another exchanged a look with her husband. A third whispered, "That cannot be him." Yet it was. Marcus noticed none of the reactions, or perhaps he noticed all of them and simply chose not to respond. That was the thing about him. He never seemed interested in proving anything. Emily remembered asking him about that once. Why he never corrected people when they underestimated him. His answer had stayed with her ever since. Because assumptions reveal more about the person making them than the person receiving them. At the time, she thought it was an interesting observation. Tonight, she was watching it become reality. Richard pointed toward Marcus again. "Look at him. He has not given a single reason why anyone should trust him." The statement lingered in the air. Emily felt her chest tighten. The irony was overwhelming. Richard believed Marcus had done nothing. The truth was exactly the opposite. Marcus had done something so significant that Emily's entire future had changed because of it. Yet he had never spoken about it. Never used it for attention. Never mentioned it to gain respect. That silence made the truth even more powerful. Near the ballroom entrance, another guest suddenly recognized Marcus and froze. The expression spread from one face to another like a chain reaction. The room was getting closer to understanding. Much closer. And as Emily looked from her father to Marcus, she realized the secret she had protected for 3 years could not remain hidden much longer. The night that had changed her life was about to change this room as well. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. What began as a confident public judgment was slowly turning into something Richard Walker could no longer control. The whispers were no longer isolated. They were everywhere now. Guests stood in small clusters, glancing between their phones and Marcus Bennett. Some looked confused. Others looked embarrassed. A few looked genuinely stunned. Richard noticed the shift but misunderstood it. He believed people were reacting to his words. In reality, they were reacting to the information spreading quietly through the room. "This has gone on long enough," Richard announced. His voice rose above the conversations. "I think it is time for this evening to return to its purpose." He looked directly at Marcus. "You have created enough distraction." The statement drew immediate silence. Marcus stood calmly beside the window overlooking the city lights. Chicago glittered beyond the glass like a sea of stars. Inside the ballroom, every eye returned to him. Yet his expression remained unchanged. "I did not create this," Marcus said softly. Richard laughed. "Of course you did." Emily stepped forward. "No, Dad. You did." The words landed harder than she intended. Richard turned toward her. For the first time all evening, genuine frustration appeared on his face. "Emily, why are you defending him?" She opened her mouth to answer, then stopped herself. Not yet. The truth was close now. Closer than ever. Across the room, a well-known investor who had remained silent all evening finally approached another guest. "That is Marcus Bennett," he whispered. "The Marcus Bennett." The other guest stared. "The founder?" The investor nodded. Within seconds, the conversation spread to 3 more people. Then 6. Then 10. Like ripples crossing water. Richard remained unaware. "You think this man belongs in your future?" he asked. Emily looked at Marcus. Then back at her father. "I know exactly where he belongs." The certainty in her voice caused several guests to turn toward her. They could hear something beneath her words. Something personal. Something important. Richard folded his arms. "Then explain it." The challenge hung in the air. Emily felt her heart race. 3 years of silence sat on the edge of becoming public knowledge. She remembered hospital corridors. Long nights. Uncertainty. She remembered a stranger who had appeared when she needed help most and who had asked for nothing in return. Marcus noticed the conflict in her expression. Their eyes met briefly. In that moment, she saw what she had always seen in him. Calm. Patience. Dignity. He was giving her the choice. The same choice he had always given her. Around them, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Richard looked from his daughter to Marcus and back again. "What are you not telling me?" he demanded. Emily inhaled slowly. The room became perfectly still. The truth was no longer approaching. It had arrived. And within the next few moments, the story Richard Walker had spent the entire evening building was about to collapse under the weight of a single revelation. Emily looked directly at her father. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than any speech. Hundreds of eyes followed her as she took one slow step forward. Richard Walker waited impatiently. He still believed he was in control of the evening. He still believed the truth would support him. "You want to know what I am not telling you?" Emily asked. Her voice was steady, but emotion lived beneath every word. Richard nodded. "Yes." Emily glanced toward Marcus. He remained calm, standing exactly where he had been all evening. No triumph. No anger. No urgency. Just quiet patience. Then she looked back at her father. 3 years ago, when my life fell apart, Marcus was there. Confusion spread across Richard's face. Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. Emily continued. When everyone else saw a news story and moved on, Marcus stayed. The room became perfectly still. When I was overwhelmed and uncertain about my future, he helped me find my footing again. He never asked for recognition. He never told anyone. He never used it to gain influence. Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" Emily swallowed hard. The memory was still powerful. "I am talking about the person who stepped into my life during the hardest season I have ever experienced." Her voice trembled slightly. "The person who quietly made sure I had every opportunity to rebuild my future." A guest near the front lowered his head. Another stared at Marcus with growing respect. Emily pointed gently toward him. "You keep asking what he brings into my life." She paused. "Hope. Wisdom. Integrity. Character." Richard's expression hardened. That does not explain why everyone is acting like he is some kind of hero. Emily smiled sadly. Because they are finally learning who he really is. At that moment, one of the investors who had recognized Marcus stepped forward. Richard, he said carefully, you may want to look him up. Richard turned toward the man in disbelief. The investor held up his phone. Several nearby guests did the same. The realization was no longer limited to whispers. It was visible everywhere now. Richard's eyes moved from one face to another. The confidence he had carried all evening began slipping away. Emily took a deep breath. You called him unworthy. Her words echoed across the ballroom. You judged him before asking a single question. She looked around the room. Marcus Bennett built companies that employ thousands of people. He funds scholarships. He supports communities. He changes lives without asking for applause. Richard stared at Marcus. For the first time that night, he truly looked at him. Not at his clothes. Not at his appearance. At the man himself. Emily's eyes filled with emotion. The truth is simple, Dad. She shook her head slowly. The person you spent all evening dismissing is one of the finest people I have ever known. And as the weight of her words settled over the ballroom, the story Richard had built began collapsing under the truth he could no longer ignore. The ballroom stood in stunned silence. No one rushed to speak. No one hurried to rescue the conversation. The truth Emily had revealed hung in the air like a spotlight that could not be turned off. Richard Walker looked around the room and saw something he had not expected to see. People were no longer looking at Marcus with doubt. They were looking at him with admiration. The shift was impossible to ignore. A few minutes earlier, guests had quietly accepted Richard's judgment. Now they were quietly questioning it. Several people lowered their phones after reading article after article about Marcus Bennett's accomplishments. Others looked visibly uncomfortable as they replayed the evening in their minds. They remembered the assumptions. They remembered the comments. They remembered how quickly they had followed Richard's lead. Across the room, one guest finally broke the silence. Marcus Bennett founded Bennett Global Ventures. Another nodded. His education foundation has funded thousands of scholarships. A third added, my company partnered with one of his organizations last year. The statement spread through the ballroom one after another. Not as praise. As fact. Simple facts that should have been known before any judgments were made. Richard listened as each piece of information chipped away at the story he had created. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain of what to say next. Emily watched him carefully. She knew her father. Confidence had always been one of his greatest strengths. Tonight it had become his greatest weakness. He had become so certain of his assumptions that he never stopped to verify them. Marcus remained exactly where he was. Calm. Composed. Unmoved by the sudden change in public opinion. That surprised people almost as much as the truth itself. Many expected satisfaction. Others expected a speech. Instead, Marcus offered neither. He simply stood there while the room corrected itself. An older businessman slowly approached him. Mr. Bennett, he said respectfully, I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up sooner. Marcus offered a small nod. Thank you. Nothing more. No lecture. No humiliation. The exchange only deepened the contrast between him and the situation unfolding around him. Richard noticed it too. The man he had spent the evening criticizing was showing more grace than anyone else in the room. Near the front of the ballroom, another guest shook his head quietly. The remarkable part is not what Marcus accomplished, he said. It is that he never once mentioned it. Several people agreed. They realized that Marcus could have ended the confrontation from the beginning. He could have listed titles, achievements, awards, and business successes. He chose not to. Instead, he allowed people to reveal their own character. Emily could see the realization spreading through the crowd. The evening was no longer about wealth, status, or influence. It was about judgment. About assumptions. About how quickly people decide who belongs and who does not. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. The room that had supported him earlier now felt very different. Not hostile. Just honest. And honesty had become impossible to avoid. As the silence returned once more, everyone sensed that the final chapter of the evening was approaching, and that the most important words had not yet been spoken. The silence that settled over the ballroom felt different now. Earlier, it had been filled with judgment. Now it was filled with reflection. Richard Walker stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, surrounded by people who had witnessed the entire evening unfold. The city skyline shimmered beyond the windows, but no one was looking outside anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the small space between Richard and Marcus Bennett. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Then Richard finally lowered his head. The gesture was subtle, yet it carried more weight than any argument he had made all night. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The words seemed almost unfamiliar to him. A few guests exchanged surprised glances. Others simply listened. Richard looked directly at Marcus. "I judged you before I knew you. I decided who you were without giving you the chance to tell your own story." The ballroom remained silent. No one interrupted. No one rushed the moment. Marcus studied him for a second before responding. "Most people do not wake up planning to judge someone unfairly," he said. "It happens when assumptions become stronger than curiosity." The room absorbed every word. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. For years she had known the man standing beside her. She had seen his character when no cameras were present. She had watched him help people who could never repay him. Tonight, everyone else had finally seen a small part of what she had known all along. Richard exhaled slowly. "You could have embarrassed me tonight." Marcus shook his head. "That was never the goal." Richard looked genuinely confused. "Then why stay?" Marcus glanced around the ballroom. At the guests. At Emily. At the people who had spent the evening learning an unexpected lesson. "Because leaving would have protected a misunderstanding," he said. "Staying gave the truth a chance to arrive." The words settled over the room like a final piece falling into place. Several guests nodded quietly. Others looked down, reflecting on their own assumptions. The evening had become something none of them expected. It was no longer about status, influence, or reputation. It was about dignity. Emily stepped beside Marcus and smiled. For the first time all night, the tension was gone. Richard noticed it too. He looked at his daughter and then back at Marcus. "Thank you," he said. Marcus offered a small nod. Nothing more was needed. The ballroom slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked softly. The musicians began playing again. Yet the atmosphere felt different than before. Lighter. Wiser. More honest. As guests returned to their tables, many carried the same thought with them. Character cannot be measured by appearance. Worth cannot be determined by assumptions. And respect should never depend on whether someone fits an expectation. Marcus looked once more at the city lights beyond the glass. Then he turned back toward the celebration. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded recognition. He had not defended himself with titles or accomplishments. He had simply allowed the truth to speak when the time was right. And in the end, the truth proved stronger than every assumption in the room.